Hello, I'm Diana Thomas.
And I'm Tom Harper,
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show.
a podcast about the historical, geographical, natural, and human background to the world of Wilbur Smith.
The mother city came up over the horizon at last. The walls of the temple shone a ruddy rose in the sunlight, and the lower city was brilliant white, the walls of the houses painted with the ash of the lake shellfish. The war fleet of Opet streamed out from the harbour to meet them. The shields and helmets of the legionaries sparkled in the sun as each ship in turn wheeled across the flagship's bows, with the gilt work on her arrow-sharp prow catching the sunlight. They saw the raw skins hanging below the standard of House Barker, and a cheer roared out across the water. The flagship let them into the harbour, still scudding on the drive of her banked oars. Habakkuk Lal aimed at the stone jetty below the city, where the crowds thronged the shore. The entire population of the city was out in their best and most brilliant robes, shrieking and cheering their new king from 100,000 throats. At the last possible moment, Habakkuk Lal dropped his hand in a signal to the drummer and steersman. The ship spun on her heel, with every oar clawing at the water to drag her to a halt, her side lightly touching the stone jetty. Lannan Hyrcanus and his train stepped ashore.
That was a reading from approximately the midpoint of Wilbur Smith's 1971 novel, The Sunbird. And if you were listening to our last episode, you may wonder why on earth are we suddenly in a ancient, magnificent city when we last left you, dear listeners, we were in 1971, contemporary at time of writing, Botswana. If you're reading the book, you might also be wondering this, because as you'll recall from the last episode, the first half of this novel, The Sunbird, takes our three protagonists, Ben Kazin, Lauren Stuyvesant, and Sally Benator, as they venture into the wilds of Botswana and discover this ancient city, the city of Opet. They discover its records, they discover its temple with its mysterious green pool under a very high drop. They discover its treasure house, and they discover the tombs of its 47 kings. And when we last saw our heroes, two of them, Ben and Lauren, had just ingested the potentially fatal fungus that had left them hallucinating, insane, and as we say, close to death. And suddenly, at that moment, pretty much bang on the midpoint of the book, Wilbur does something absolutely extraordinary. And I really struggle to think of any other books that pull this, have the kind of audacity to pull this kind of trick, Diana.
Yeah, what he does is he takes us from a spot in modern day Botswana in 1971 back to the exact same spot in about 400 AD. And therefore, he moves us from a dead city, an archaeological site, barely visible from the ground, and its relics, back to the point when it is the thriving, prosperous, bustling city of Opet, the center of a kind of southern African empire established by Carthaginians, which is to say Phoenicians, who have escaped the destruction of Carthage in about 146 BC, traveled all the way through along the coast of North Africa, through the states of Gibraltar, down the west coast of Africa, and then into Central Africa itself to found their own city. And it's Opet. And what has just happened is that the king, the newly crowned king of Opet, Lannon, has come back to his people, having succeeded in the ritual that is essential for the establishment of his position, which is
He is the ritual is the killing of the Grai lion, which is some sort of super lion. It's sort of in some ways typical of Wilbur that the opening act of this story is killing what is quite possibly the very last of this kind of rare animal,
it is the very last.
and rendering it extinct.
It's sort of like a lion equivalent to a
Yeah,
great big saber-toothed tiger, isn't it?
yeah,
It has those saber teeth, and it's a sort of mega lion. It is to a lion what a mammoth is to an elephant, or
yeah, yeah,
And Lannon has had to go out armed only with a spear. It's very typical. I mean, it's like all sorts of hunting rituals in Africa, which persisted well into the 19th century, where in order to achieve manhood in a tribe, you had to go out and confront either another warrior or a wild animal and prove your manliness by killing it. And it's significant, not just because, as you say, Tom, it's very Wilbur-esque, that he doesn't just he kills the Gray lion, the male, but the female is there as well, and she attacks him, so he has to kill both of them. In so doing, he wipes out the animal, which of course is very symbolic because having wiped out the animal, then no further kings. I don't think the people of Opet or indeed Lannon himself think this through. But once you've killed the final Gray lion, you've also killed the possibility of having any more ritual slaughterings of Gray lions,
no.
which also means, therefore, that you have no means of crowning a new king unless you go and find something else he has to kill. But I think that's an important bit of symbolism.
Yeah, it's really nicely symbolic, isn't it? And this idea that absolutely at the peak of their powers, they've also basically sown seeds of their destruction, which, as we will see, becomes something of a prophecy. So Lannan Hyrcanus is this golden man. He's tall, he's strong, he's absolutely a god among men, really.
He's
And
Lauren Stuyvesant in a
he is
in a.
he is suspiciously similar to Lauren
And
Stuyvesant.
that's the. I mean, that's that. He is not only suspicious. I mean, he actually plainly
Yeah,
is, as it were. It's almost like a.
yeah,
It's what the opposite of reincarnation is. He's the pre-incarnation.
pre-incarnation. Yeah, and his best friend, companion, and sidekick is this guy called Hui Ben Ammon, who has been the scribe of the golden tablets that were found in part one. Now we see Hui come to life.
Who's Jewish also.
He is also Jewish, he is Jewish, but although that hasn't stopped him becoming the high priest
No.
of Baal, who is
Ah, yeah,
the
yeah,
Carthaginian
yeah.
Phoenician sun god. Um,
Indeed not.
and he is a hunchback. He is an extraordinary poet and singer with his lyre. He is a great linguist. And he is also something of a polymath. He's a warrior. He's an administrator. He's a counselor. And he prefigures very, very much. I don't think anyone reading this book can miss it. Taita. He is a sort of proto Taita, which is fascinating because I can't remember when River God was written, but it's something like 20 years later.
Yes, and it's early, very early. It's almost exactly 20 years later. I think it comes out in 92 or 93. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So he would,
Um,
and of course he is the ancient equivalent to the protagonist and first person narrator of the first half of the book, Benjamin Kazin, sorry. So again, you have this direct parallel that the relationship between Ben and Lauren is the relationship between Hui and Lannon.
yeah. And we join the city really, I think, at the peak of its powers. It's governing a vast swathe of sort of southern Central Africa, stretching all the way across to Zimbabwe, to the coast, to the grasslands of the south and the mountains of the north. And the city, which was founded by these Phoenician exiles, is absolutely the preeminent power in this region.
Oh, and I mean, and it's absolutely organized like a classical state, a Mediterranean classical state. So the military is organized along Roman cohorts and legionaries. It has highly evolved administration, government. It's got Again, very much like the Roman Empire, it has legions stationed along distant rivers, sort of like the legions on the Rhine or the Danube, um, who are holding um, the just as the Roman legions held what they would describe as barbarians at bay, so the legions of Opet are holding back essentially the black tribes coming down from the north.
Yeah, this is the Great Bantu Migration, which is the great kind of population movement that
Indeed,
I think probably defines modern Africa.
absolutely.
Because until then, the people who've lived in the area, let's say we're in kind of modern day Botswana and its environs, have been Bushmen, um,
Yes.
who themselves are also being pushed out by the Bantu. So there is this sense of population pressure against the borders. So as you say, it's very much like the late Roman Empire. And there's also the environmental degradation because the lake is becoming choked with weeds. The path to the sea, which is their one sort of way out as a trading civilization, is drying up. It's getting thinner and thinner. So it requires ever more dredging. So yeah, it's a civilization in tremendous power, but also with real pressures on it.
I mean, which again is, as happens, exactly like Rome. That the problem with Rome was that if you fail to maintain the aqueducts
Yeah,
that bring water into a city of well over 1 million people, that city finds it very hard to function very, very quickly. And so,
yeah,
yeah, and I mean, and they, and and they also they've made contact with the Arabs,
yes, on the east coast of Africa.
yeah, with whom they've sort of had a common cause against the Bantu tribes. And again, there's that sort of echo of the Romans in the Middle East. The to and forth between Persian and Roman power in the Middle East was a huge factor in Roman rise and then fall,
Yeah,
which is of course in the fall, where in 400 AD, pretty much the point at which Rome itself is finally um, sacked by the barbarians.
yeah. And so Lannan Hyrcanus has become the king with Hui as his sort of closest confidant and counselor. So they embark on a royal progress around it's called the Four Kingdoms, the different parts of the kingdom.
There is, by the way, a real Game of Thrones. I mean, this is again written way, way, way before Game of Thrones. But I couldn't help feeling a strong, House of Barker and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and the nine families who form the council of the realm.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's
I
definitely
can't
that.
I can't help wondering whether George R. Martin was ever a fan of Wilbur Smith, because there's a strong,
Yeah,
yeah.
be interesting to know.
Anyway, sorry.
Anyway, and on this progress, we meet two more characters who form the remainder of the kind of quartet of characters that drive this half of the book. So we meet a young woman called Tanith, who is identified as a person with oracular powers, and she is brought back to the city of Opet to work in the temple of Astarte, the moon goddess. And it turns out that actually the cave with the pool that we have found in part one is actually the shrine where she sits and delivers her oracular visions.
She is also Hui's great love. I mean, he's troubled because he's a priest and she's a priestess and an oracle. So it's not right for them to ever get together. And yet he is absolutely passionately in love with her, and we get a sense that she is with him too. So there's this sense of star-crossed lovers, that they love each other, but they can never be together.
Yeah,
Is the setup.
yeah.
Um, and
And then the other character we meet is they go up to the northern frontier and they're going to launch a raid across the river. And in fact, this is a slave gathering raid because, like most classical civilizations, Opet is a slave society that has enslaved first the Bushmen and then later the kind of black Africans that they managed to capture to work in their mines, their galleys, and all the other jobs that they want to do themselves.
brief interlude here. It's an interesting question as to whether most classical civilizations were slave societies. Almost all had slaves in them, but societies which actually depended upon slaves for the running of the entire show are rare. I mean, Rome and Athens, basically, and all sorts of other places you think of having slaves weren't. Contrariwise, African cultures assumed the taking of slaves as part of your booty in a victory. So there's a kind of mix where slavery is sort of plays different roles in different societies. Sorry, that was just a brief interlude there, but
No, I mean, it's a true and good point. So they cross the river and they discover this tribe called the Vendi, who are suddenly way more organized than any Black African tribe they've encountered previously, and are fighting in a much more disciplined, tactically astute kind of way. Now, they are still no match for the great legions of Opet. They're defeated, and their king is captured, and their king is a man called Manatasi. And they have the opportunity to kill him, but something persuades Hai that this is a man to whom he has some kind of a bond, and he does not want to kill him.
and this is where the final character link between the first and second half of the book resolves. In last week's episode, we discussed a character called Timothy Mageba, who appears as Ben Kazin's friend and colleague, and then becomes a rebel leader. And his story appears to be kind of interesting and quite very exciting at times.
It brings in a couple of really big kind of action set pieces.
Absolutely, but not directly relevant to the story of the first half of the book. But Manatasi is going to be hugely, hugely relevant to the second half of the book. There's a very important link physiologically between Manasseh and Timothy, is that they are both ostrich-footed or ostrich-toed. That is to say, there's a cleft, a deep cleft between their big toe and the rest of their foot and their toes, their other toes. So that again makes the parallel between them very, very clear. And Hai's decision to keep Manatasi alive against Lanon's strong advice, Hai basically kind of tricks Lanon into letting him survive. And then he's renamed, he gets a sort of slave name of Tanith. Sorry, not Tanith. Sorry,
Timon.
Timon. He gets a slave name.
Not to be confused with. Sorry,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, not to be confused. Isn't Timon the meerkat in the Lion King?
Yes, I'm going to nick that joke.
Yeah, go for it.
I think they sing. What's this? Hakuna Matata.
Hakuna Matata. Yeah.
Okay. So, against Lanon's orders, really, and certainly against his advice, Hai lets Manatasi live, but he's enslaved, and he's given the name of Timon, which, of course, in the years to come, would be confusing, perhaps, to modern readers, because it's the name of a meerkat who sings Hakuna Matata in The Lion King. I think it's safe to say that Timon is not the kind of chap who sings Hakuna Matata.
In fact, that's pretty much the opposite of his life philosophy.
He's totally not a Hakuna Matata kind of guy.
No.
What he is at first is a very astute and devoted student, and Hai kind of falls prey to his own vanity here.
Yeah.
Because he teaches Timon basically the kind of rules of, at the time, contemporary military strategy. You know, using examples of great battles fought by Hannibal or by Alexander, and he shows Timon exactly how to organize an army. I don't think it's a spoiler. I think it's very clear as you're reading this, thinking, this is not going to end well, because Timon, who is playing the role of the loyal slave and devoted student, is all the time thinking of himself as Manatasi, and has every single intention of going back and reclaiming his crown.
Yeah, and I think it's worth just sort of pausing to talk about the characters here a bit, because we talked in the last episode, we sort of disagreed a bit as to, is the contemporary story built around three core characters, i.e. Ben, Sally, and Lauren, or is it four, including Timothy? And my argument was Timothy's at best a sort of half presence in the first half. what's interesting is the second half, those four characters all have their counterparts, um, or their pre-incarnations, as you have it. But here, Manatasi, the Timothy counterpart, is much, much more strongly drawn and is much more central to the story. In fact,
Yes,
I felt in the second half that actually it's Tanith, who's Sally's counterpart, who is the least well drawn and has the least to do,
yes,
and Manatasi. And you see this very much in the way Wilbur chooses to tell the story, because the first part is all first person Ben Kazin's narration. The second part is told in the third person, mainly sticking with Hoy, but he does wander to other characters. And the character who gets the most time, other than Hoy, is Manatasi. And actually, we see quite a lot of the story from his point of view, which is giving him extraordinary precedence in the story. And I think shows how absolutely central, and also, and this is something I think we can come to later when we talk about sort of the overtones and some of the things that people have read into this story. But actually, he is given a lot of sympathetic material. We really suffer with him.
I was going to say, I think it's very interesting and instructive. We've talked in the past about the role that Black African characters have in Wilbur's books, and very often the two roles they tend to have are either as sidekicks or antagonists. In this particular case, you have a character who is the antagonist, as it were, of the city of Opet for very, very good reasons. In his mind, his motivation is absolutely clear and absolutely justified. But Wilbur goes to a great length to show how, as Tom was saying, how he's made to suffer, because what happens is that Hoy spots Timon.
Manatasi.
Okay, so Manatas is as a slave, Timon, with his lover, Selene, who's also a slave, and he's very happy for the two of them. But what they have done is kind of illegal within the city. The slaves are not allowed to have relationships. They then try to escape, and they're caught. And once again, Hui pleads for Timon's life. Selene is
Well,
executed. Well,
she's tied behind an elephant and
yeah,
dragged across the ground for miles until she's basically battered to death.
yes. Um, Timon is basically sent down into the mines, weighed down with these incredibly heavy chains. So the chains which are attached to any slave that's tried to escape, and he suffers terribly. And it's plain and he escapes from the mines. And at this point, he's acting as a hero would do. And and having escaped from the mines, he plots his revenge on the people who put him there, which is to say, Lanon and basically the society of Opet. He sets about re-establishing himself as a king and a warlord, and of course now he is helped by the fact that he understands his enemy's strategy and he knows how to execute it himself. And he's an extraordinarily charismatic figure, and he builds up this enormous force of people as more and more tribes are drawn into his orbit. And he basically goes to the Arabs, who have traditionally been the allies of Opet, and kind of makes them an offer they can't refuse. I mean, it's very, very clear to them that they kind of have the choice that they can either be with him or they can be against him, and it'd be a seriously bad idea to be against him. And this threat is developing beyond the borders of Opet, and the people in Opet have no idea of the storm that is brewing.
Yeah, I think one of the things you'd have to say Opet's intelligence network is pretty poor, because they are clueless.
Well, they are, and except, or actually, what's happened is that Manasseh has turned, in contemporary spying terms, he's turned their agents into double agents.
Yes,
So,
that's
so
true.
they
Yeah.
think that they think that they have an excellent spy network. What
Yes.
they don't realize is that he has already controlled it. I
Yeah.
mean, that indeed reminds me of writing stories about in the Saffron stories about SOE sending agents into occupied Europe, and they thought they were being tremendously clever.
Yes.
And in fact, every single agent sent into the Low Countries, as a matter of fact, was either caught and executed or turned into a double agent for the Germans.
Yeah. Meanwhile, back in Opet, various things have been happening. Chief of which is that Hui, our hero, has consummated his relationship with Tanith, the Oracle. She, again, in sort of an echo of Sally and Ben, she comes to his bed one night during a festival, one of these sort of licentious Saturnalian type festivals where all the rules are suspended, and she comes to his bed and surprises him there. And they become lovers. And I think it's worth saying that it's interesting that they become quite uncomplicated lovers. It's complicated by the fact that they can't have the relationship, so they always have to keep it secret because he's a priest and she's an oracle and supposed to remain chaste. But there's no one else involved. Whereas in the contemporary story, Sally and Ben's love is very much complicated, and
Yeah.
there's other factors at play which we didn't really go into in the past previous
Although
episode.
Lannon does play a role in
Yes,
at the very
sure,
end.
but in the course of their, it's not a love, it's not a love triangle between in terms of vying for
No,
Tanith's affections.
no,
What is a love triangle is actually, and this is again a very Wilbur thing, is that Lannon the king and Hui have been best friends and inseparable companions. And as Hui falls more in love with Tanith and devotes more of his time to having his sort of illicit affair with her, he ignores Lannon. And Lannon is jealous, not sexually, but of Hui's attention. And there's this lovely phrase that Wilbur uses, this lovely description of, when we're seeing it from Lannon's point of view, which sort of really captures the joy of a really, really close friendship. This is Lannon sort of reflecting how his presence had provided the zest that made each triumph more valuable, each disappointment or disaster easier to surmount. All the good things happened when Hui was there. And it's really beautifully capturing this sort of masculine friendship.
and also the way in which Lannon hides his sadness and his loss by as it were outwardly being incredibly angry and and furious with Hoy, mostly because Hoy won't come and see him for sort of late night drinking sessions and chatting and sing songs because he's too busy having it off with Tanith. But it's really good, I think, as much as there are as much as there are parallels between the first and second half of the book. What's really nice is, as you've said before, for example, with Timothy Stroke Manasseh, there are modulations on it, so it's not as if the exact same things play out.
Yeah.
The same characters play different. They have different narrative and emotional arcs.
Yeah, it's almost like jazz, where you've got the same basic building blocks, but he's
Yes.
improvising a different theme
Yeah.
based
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
the same characters. Yes, which I really liked, because I thought at one point it was going to be a sort of retread, and that would actually been quite tedious because you'd know exactly how it's going
No.
to end. Whereas here, it's different. You've got the same four characters, but in a sort of different configuration of affections.
You know how it must end.
Yes, you do.
You just don't know how it's going to end.
Well,
And
because you've seen the archaeological site of the city where no two stones are left standing upon each other. So yeah,
exactly, and you know that at some point, and you have a pretty clear idea who's going to end it,
yeah,
but you don't know how that's going to happen
yeah.
until you sort of do, and then there's that kind of awful sense of of impending doom.
Yeah, it's sort of like Titanic, isn't it? Where
Yeah, yeah.
you know how it's going to end and you know what's going to happen, but you're sort of absolutely gripped and fascinated to read on to, and almost part of you thinking maybe it won't happen. You know, maybe
Yes.
maybe this is the version where the ship doesn't sink and the city isn't destroyed.
Or Leo doesn't sing beneath the water as Celine Dion is singing.
Yes. The other thing that's happened is that because Ben is sorry, the other thing that's happened is because Hui feels this incredible connection with Manatassi, aka Timon. He has actually really pushed his friendship with Lannon to breaking point by
Yes.
demanding that he spare Manatassi and not execute him. And again, it's interesting because Hui is
twice over.
actually completely wrong here. You'd have to say that by far the
Yeah.
best thing
Mm.
for all of them, and certainly for the city of Opet, would have just been to execute Manitassi like any other rebel stroke
Yes,
runaway.
I mean, I, the only thing that's missing here, actually, in the story, now I think about it, is there a point in the book in which, as it were, Hui realizes that he is responsible for this absolutely catastrophic mistake and feels any sense of remorse for it? I'm not sure there is,
I'm not sure there is, no.
because it's weird that as it were, he has made this terrible mistake, and yet somehow, and of course there is a terrible price to be paid for it, but there's never a sense that that is a key issue, because at the point, the thing which is bothering him by the end of the story is what is happening to Tanith.
Yeah, yeah,
He doesn't know it actually. There is or let's put it this way, the tragic aspect of the story on an emotional level is about Hui and Tanith, not about what Hui has done by allowing Timon stroke Manassi to live.
yeah. And so I think there's one more thing about Manassi, and then we'll get to what happens to poor Tanith. So, as we say, he goes over
The clue is in the words poor Tanith.
poor Tanith, yeah.
Poor Tanith,
Poor
poor
Tanith.
Tanith, poor, poor
Also poor
Tanith.
Manitassi, because he has sort of two bites at the cherry of rebuilding his power. And the first time he comes, and Hui faces him again across the river with his legions,
Yeah.
and Hui uh, is a bit of a tactical genius, again like Taita. So Hui absolutely destroys him, destroys his army, and as they're trying to cross the river, and Manitassi flees. He flees to an island in the middle of the river. Hui, who, like Ben, has extraordinary upper and lower body strength, all his limbs are incredibly powerful around this sort of hunchbacked torso. He swims after him, catches him on the island again, yet again. Probably should just kill him, but can't bring himself to do it because he feels this thing. So instead, he chops off his hand as a so that he can never wield a sword against against Opet again. Manitassi, being a resourceful chap, turns this to his advantage. Life gives you lemons, make lemonades. Life chops off your hand, make a new metal lion claw hand that can rip people's faces off.
Which is a good thing to have, let's be honest. How often have we thought, if only my hand was a great big claw and I could rip that so
Yeah,
and so's
and
face
and
off? I mean, you
yeah,
can see the
and this
appeal.
is sort of the transformation of Manitassi into this absolutely remorseless killing machine. He
Yes.
amasses an army. As you say, he goes to the Arabs. He gets them involved. He goes to it seems like every tribe in the southern half of Africa, and basically makes them bow down to him and give them up men to serve in his army. Meanwhile, in Opet, Tanith and Hui have been pursuing their affair, and the inevitable has happened, as indeed happens to Lostris in Rivergod. Tanith has fallen pregnant.
Yeah, and as with other kind of doomed romances, there's a figure who's equivalent to the nurse in Romeo and Juliet,
Yes.
because there's a sort of ancient priestess who is supposed to be, as we're chaperoning Tanis to precisely make sure that nobody gets their hands on her.
Yeah.
But Hui has been sending her off to sleep by basically doping her wine.
with opium, effectively, which
No,
yeah.
I think it's with actually it's with hemp seeds, so it's dope. It's cannabis. If we're going to be specific about drugs. So she's happily floating away on this elixir, which she absolutely loves. She can't wait to go around to Tanith to Hui's to have a nice drink of his doped up red wine. But but the but the priestesses, they are immensely jealous of Tanith. They're jealous of her powers. They're jealous of her influence because the king kind of depends upon her. They're jealous of everything about her beauty, her youth, and this simmering resentment is going to have terrible consequences as the book plays out.
Yes, because they discover that she's pregnant. She's violated the rules. She actually then miscarries the baby, but thus revealing the evidence.
Because of them,
Yep.
they thought
Yeah.
they
Beat her up. And so she is then every year every 5 years they have a festival, a sort of first fruits festival. And the climax of this festival is they send a messenger to the gods. And the way you send a messenger to the gods is you have a human sacrifice. And the way they do this human sacrifice is that, we discussed in the previous episode, there is this pool, this bottomless pool in the cave, which is the temple to the goddess, with this oculus above it and a little kind of stone diving board that contemporary archaeologists have discovered. And it turns out the purpose of this diving board is it is literally a diving board. You take your human sacrifice, your messenger to the gods, and you push them off the end of it, weighted down with golden chains, so there's no chance they'll swim, and they crash down, possibly die as soon as they hit the water. If not, they die pretty soon afterwards as they get sucked down into the bottomless depths.
Luckily, we think, a messenger has been sent to Hui, who is out on the border, coming to terms with the approach of this gigantic horde, saying, come quick, Tanith is in danger. And she thinks that he's going to come to save her. But
yes, because the idea is that Lannan can deny Hui nothing once Hui really puts his mind to it. He's incredibly persuasive.
exactly.
And so, yes.
And because Lannon has agreed that Tanith should be that he is sacrifice, partly because he's incredibly cross with her because she's given him all sorts of prophecies indicating that his future is essentially very short and terminal. Bad, very,
Yes, the
very,
classic case of shooting the messenger.
absolutely, very bad things are in store for him. But in time-honored fashion, the messenger does not get through. But it's okay because Hoy is actually coming back to the city. All may yet be saved.
But Hui, having no idea that Tanith is in danger, goes straight to the palace because he's all thinking about Manatasi and his vast army that's coming down. So he goes to the palace. He tells Lannan all about it, and then because he's covered hundreds of miles in about 3 days on foot, he passes out, and not realizing anything about the danger that Tanith is in. So Aina, the nurse, thinks, "Oh well, I'll go and warn him." But again, fate intervenes because one of these nasty, embittered nuns smothers her, just to make sure that nothing can stop her revenge on Tanith, who she hates for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that she wants to be the next kind of Mother Superior.
As a result of which, Hai wakes up in time for the great ceremony and is expecting to go there to sing one of his legendary "Sing us your greatest hits," Hai.
Yes. Or the hymn to the goddess that accompanies the plunge of the sacrifice into the pool.
Absolutely. Just as the Eagles cannot do a show without Hotel California, or the Stones can't do a show without Jumping Jack Flash, so you cannot have a ceremony without Hoy coming in and singing his great song.
Yeah.
And as he gets there, he sees that the sacrifice of the year is Tanith,
Yeah.
and there's nothing he can do about it.
Yeah. And this is really the point at which everything collapses very quickly. Tanith is dead, Hui is heartbroken, and Manatasi is bearing down on the city with an army of, I think Wilbur gives a figure of like 750,000 men, which by ancient standards is extraordinary. I mean, it's beyond almost any army that gets put in the field until probably the 20th century.
Yeah.
So these are very much the last days of Opet, and I think rather than talk through every last twist and turn of the final battle, it's fair to say we know how this is going to end because Opet is going to end up with the figures that we found in the tomb of Lannan and Hui among the tomb of the kings, and with the city absolutely razed to the ground. And it's funny, when the Romans destroyed Carthage, it was the most comprehensive destruction in the ancient world, legendary destruction.
Yes.
And the famous line from the history is, "So that no two stones stood on top of each other." And it's
Delenda est Carthago is the Latin for
yes, Carthage must be destroyed. And you sort of feel for the poor Opetians because it's happened to them twice now. First in Carthage and now in Opet.
You'd think they'd learn, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I think there's two things I want to go into as in the rest of the show. One is the fact that we've had about 300 pages of this massive story. And in all of this, the the characters who we got to know and love in the first half of the book remain, so far as we know, in the middle of this kind of fatal Curse of Tutankhamun trance. We've never flipped back to them once, so they are exactly the state of stasis that we sort of in suspended animation where we left them halfway through the book.
Well, they're assumed to be. I mean, I think the two guys are assumed to be dead.
Well,
And in fact,
it's
I read the entire book thinking, wow, this is extraordinary creative bravery on Wilbur's part, in the sense that, I mean, obviously you know the ancient characters are going to die because
yeah, we've seen
it's
their bodies.
but also, I mean, it's 1,500 years ago, so hello.
Yeah.
Um, but to kill both is extraordinary, you think, but you might be wrong.
To readers, anyone reading this in the Kindle edition, uh, there's a bit of sleight of hand, which I think is just an accident, where you get to the end of the Opet sequence, the ancient sequence, and the screen that you get on a Kindle when you finish a book saying, rate this book, if you enjoyed this book, here are some other things you might like, flashes up.
Oh my goodness.
And you think, oh my gosh, that's the end. We're never ever going to find out what
No.
happened conclusively to Ben and to Laren. If you are reading the Kindle edition, dear reader, flip past that, close that screen, and keep going, because there is more. In fact, then there's a page of footnotes, and then you actually get a little sort of postscript, which actually gives you a little bit more kind of closure. So that's my top tip to readers reading the
It's a
Kindle
very
edition.
good top tip. If you are like me and you actually like the books that are books, that problem doesn't arise. But it's a bit like what you're describing. It's a bit like those movies, like a
Yes, yeah,
Marvel movie where you
yeah.
have to sit through like more credits than you can possibly believe, where there are like 3,000 people, every single one of whom has to be named, who've done all the CGI or whatever. And finally, you get this little kind of bit at the
Sort
end,
of
which
stinger at the end. Yeah,
which sets up the next film or whatever. But also, in this particular case, the book is resolved by a series of newspaper cuttings. So
yes,
you go straight from, weirdly enough, actually in the actual book, the problem is exactly the opposite. It's that you go straight from, there's no ending at all.
yeah,
The last sentence of the kind of op-ed sequence is there, and then suddenly you see these newspaper cuttings, like whoa, and you
right,
sort of do a quick
yeah,
double take. But it does pull everything together.
yeah,
But in the meantime, what I would say is that each of the two halves by itself would be insufficient as a book, but taken together, they're amazing.
yeah. I would actually be a little bit kinder than that. I think each of the two halves by itself would be a cracking novel. Taken together, they're on another level again.
Well, actually, they'd be a cracking novel, as it were, if each of them was expanded to full novel length. If you see what I mean. So if each
Yeah,
half was like, it's the combination of the two.
yeah,
And to anybody, it's not, and to anybody who loves Wilbur's books, they are also completely fascinating because you can see in them the kind of seeds of all sorts of ideas, which we've sort of hinted at as we've been going along, of all sorts of ideas and themes and characters and settings that are going to become absolutely central to his work over the next 20 or 30 years.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, the one other thing I want to talk about, I think we probably do need to address the elephant in the room. There are people who see in this novel a lament for the loss of white rule in Africa. This idea that the Opet civilization, the Phoenicians, are a kind of white minority who come in, establish this tremendous civilization, which brings kind of enlightenment and civilization to darkest Africa, and then that the black Africans swarm in and destroy them and cannot preserve this the light is overwhelmed by the darkness, and the fact that in the character the explicit kind of link between the character of Manatasi, the Bantu king, and then Timothy Mageba, who is effectively a sort of Robert Mugabe style guerrilla leader, freedom fighter, in anti-colonialist. You can't completely dismiss that idea, I think.
I take that point, but I think certainly the Timothy character in the first half of the book is not presented at all sympathetically once he becomes a freedom fighter. And the Chinese and the guerrillas are absolutely presented as villains. On the other hand, this is why I was going on about how Manitassi is presented. I think there's a very good, I guess it just depends which way you see it. You could just as easily interpret it as the comeuppance of a slave society. You have a character who is a free person who is forced into slavery twice in two different ways, who is initially kind of belittled, not intentionally by Huey, but he's kind of patronized by Hoy, and then actively tortured and abused, and who takes his revenge upon this slave society by reclaiming the land for the people. Well, actually, as you say, they aren't strictly speaking the people who lived there before, because the people who lived there before are the Bushmen, but nevertheless, he reclaims Africa for the Africans. And so you could equally see this as a kind of a parable of Africa in the 20th century being reclaimed from white societies and indeed white slavers by indigenous Africans. So I think it kind of depends which way you see it from. I mean, I can certainly see that argument in the first half, as I say. I think the second half of the book, though, is deeply sympathetic to the suffering of Manitassi, and I think it's therefore much more of almost like one of Tanith's prophecies. It's an oracle saying this is what's going to happen because this is how you've treated people.
Yeah, I'd say I read the critique before I read the book, so I was sort of thinking about it as I read it, and I mean, it's a work of literature, so it's open to many interpretations.
Yeah.
But certainly, I think if you read it, and certainly reading those Manitassi sections, I think giving so much voice and agency to Manitassi as a character, really, you, as you say, the tragic fate of Opet becomes kind, as you say, kind of their comeuppance. And there's actually a bit in the final battle where, as well as their black slaves and their sort of their nobles descended from the Carthaginian nobility, they also have these sort of Bushman, Opetian, sort of mixed race people who work for them and fight for them, and they abandon Opet in the middle of the battle. And one of them says, "If you had given us something to fight for, some station above that of a dog, we might have stayed with you." So again, a pretty sharp rebuke
Yes.
to the way that the people at the Opet civilization has treated the people it lives with. So yeah,
Which you could certainly say, for example, if the white settlers in Kenya had treated the black Kenyans who fought for Britain and the empire as it was then in World War II and fought very bravely in both East Africa and also in the Far East. If they had been treated well at all, or even given the slightest dignity when they came back from war, having served their crown with great courage and skill, there might not have been a Mau Mau rebellion. So that is an exact parallel to things that had happened in 20th century Africa. So I think there he is absolutely kind of saying, listen, if you treated, if the white rulers of 20th century Africa had treated the people who'd fought for them well, they might not now have rebellions against them all across Africa.
yeah, I think the other my final thought on this is that I'm not sure that kind of colonialism, post-colonialism, decolonialism dynamic. I don't think that's really what Wilbur's preoccupied with. I think he is, and we discussed this before on the podcast, he is very much an observer of life as it is, not as we might wish it to be. And while I think he's very, very strong on personal right and wrong, in civilizational terms, I think he's just a realist. And I think that he's what he describes is, peoples get powerful,
Yeah,
peoples, conquer, then they decline. Someone else comes along who's more powerful
yeah.
and pushes them out. And it doesn't really matter if they're black, if they're white, if they're, Phoenician or Egyptian or wherever. This is just the way of the world. It's very, again, going back to the animal kingdom. It's that there's predator and there's prey. And I don't think there's a value judgment on any of this in the way there would be if it was some kind of Afrikaner nationalist writing the novel. I think it's just there are powerful people, and then you make enemies, and if they get strong enough, they will knock you back.
Yeah. And in this particular case, you've asked for, in the case of Opet, which if we take that as being a parable, they've asked for it. They've asked for it in the general and they've asked for it in the particular. In other words, the general treatment of people and the particular treatment of one person who is going to then be their nemesis.
Yeah. So that's all we've got time for this week, wrapping up our discussion of Wilbur's seminal novel, The Sunbird, which, as we discussed at the beginning, was the novel that really charted the direction he was going to take for pretty much the rest of his career. But we're not done with the world of lost cities and ancient civilizations in Africa, because next week we're joined by the anthropologist Joost Fontaine from South Africa to talk to us about the historical ruins of Great Zimbabwe, the mysterious megaliths in the middle of the country of the same name, that remain still shrouded in mystery and speculation, and evidence of a fantastic stone building civilization that once flourished in the heart of Africa. So do join us for that.
Yes, indeed. Time to wrap up the show. So it's goodbye from me, Diana Thomas.
And it's goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer Niso Smith.